Hi, welcome to this Q&A on the Middle East. We already have a bunch of questions, so I'll start. The first one is from Harris Contos. Elon Pape has said that Zionism will ultimately fail in achieving its goals in Gaza and beyond. Yet with Gaza now destroyed and Syria being carved up by the U.S., Turkey, and various warring parties, as well as Israel, do you think Pape's belief still holds true? Pape's argument is that Israel will essentially disintegrate and is engaging in policies that, while certainly destructive to the Palestinians and the Syrians and the Lebanese, are ultimately catastrophic to Israel itself. I think Pape's even put a timeline on it within 3 years. There's a lot of unknowns. For instance, it's been clear from the inception of the genocide in Gaza that the Israelis want to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza. The first time Anthony Blinken made his rounds in the Middle East after October 7th, he purportedly carried quota proposals to various governments in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, that they would accept a certain number. I think it was 1.1 million Palestinian refugees in the Sinai and a few hundred, I think 700,000 in Iraq. I can't remember, out of this 2.3 million population. This one was evidence of how Blinken is just a water carrier for the Netanyahu government, and number two, how woefully out of touch he and everyone in the Biden administration is with the reality of the Middle East. No one was going to willingly accept Palestinian refugees. That said, Israel is rapidly depopulating northern Gaza. They have already begun tentative proposals to build settlements in northern Gaza. They today carried out all sorts of strikes in southern Gaza. I think the last operating hospital in northern Gaza was again hit today. And they have reduced the aid trucks that come from Egypt through the Rafah crossing. It's created a humanitarian crisis. There's no clean water. People are sleeping in improvised tents or out in the open. There's a serious lack of food. There's obviously no medical care. There's the complete collapse of the infrastructure. And my read on it is that Israel will continue to perpetuate this humanitarian crisis for the Palestinians, in their mind, to put pressure on outside states to finally accept the population of Gaza. At the same time, in the West Bank, if you look at a map of the West Bank and you take the areas that Israel controls, and I think there's 700 Jewish settlements or colonies in the West Bank. If you take the areas that Israel controls, including the closed military zones and the ring roads, which the special highways that can only be used by Jewish colonists and the Israeli military, etc., what they've done is essentially isolate roughly 8 pockets, 8 ghettos, Bantustans, for Palestinians. I mean, even Ramallah, which is the seat of the Palestinian Authority, is completely surrounded. It's where I was visiting my friend Ataf Abu Saif this summer. We all expect sooner rather than later for the Netanyahu government to announce an annexation of the West Bank. And that means Israel essentially incorporates this territory and leaves these distressed Palestinian enclaves to wither. And many of the tactics that have been used in Gaza are now being employed in the West Bank, including attacks against medical infrastructure and assassination of medical health workers, including doctors. There's been attack craft that have been used, especially against the residents in the Jenin refugee camp. They use these armored bulldozers to rip up, create buffer zones, rip up whole neighborhoods. And when those bulldozers go in, they also rip up the gas lines and the water lines. So people don't have water and they don't have access to gas. They've essentially shut off any ability since October 7th for Palestinians who had jobs in Israel to go back to work. So obviously, they would again like to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. That's what they would like. But no one knows. Even Israel doesn't know how all of this is going to play out. When I was in Egypt a few months ago, the Israeli journalists, I was speaking to the press reporters, Egyptian reporters, and they told me that the military high command in Egypt had made it unequivocally clear to Sisi, the president of Egypt, that there would be no Palestinians pushed into the Sinai Desert, which Egypt controls. Um, uh, so we don't know. We know what Israel's intent is. We know how it's moving the pieces on the chessboard, especially in northern Gaza. Uh, uh, but will it achieve its goals? Gideon Levy doesn't think that it will. I mean, he's also a great Israeli journalist, writes for Haaretz, and with Amira Haas has done just tremendous coverage of the Palestinian issue for years and years. But I guess the short answer to that is we don't know. We know what they want to do. We don't know if they're going to achieve it. The overthrow of the Assad regime has seen Israel seize the buffer zone, of course, in Syria, including Mount Hermon. They're not going to give that up. They have seized sections of southern Lebanon. I don't expect them to give it up. And so there's already been an expansion of quote unquote greater Israel, and Israel has carried out a very aggressive aerial campaign against military installations in Syria to essentially render the country in essence demilitarize Syria and make it incapable of even minimal military activity. Then the big question, of course, is Iran. Israel has been pushing, the Netanyahu government is pushing for some time for a war with Iran. They need the United States to join in that effort because the Iranian air defense system is quite sophisticated. The Iranian Air Force isn't worth much. In fact, many of these planes date back to the era of the Shah, but its air defense capabilities are quite good. They're actually Russian for the most part. And Israel can't. It would be a sustained bombing campaign against Iran, much as we saw during the Clinton administration against Iraq, coupled with sanctions. That's what Israel would like. I think that that's a very foolish and dangerous move, as of course do many people in the Pentagon. That's why they've steadily resisted this effort. But there are all sorts of ways Israel could draw the United States in and create a kind of fait accompli, especially as they provoke Iran, as they have, if Iran carries out missile strikes that result in significant numbers of civilian dead, or if they block shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which is important as an oil corridor. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that the United States get drawn in, despite a long-standing reticence by the U.S. military to go to war with Iran. Iran is not Lebanon. It's about the size of Europe and has 90 million people. And that could really, not only would it be catastrophic, I think, regionally, but then I think you are really flirting with the annihilation of the Israeli state. The consequences of that are just unfathomable in terms of lighting a kind of regional conflagration. Karen Yates, related to your interview with Matt Kennard, Matt's great. He's a great journalist, and it's a great interview. So watch it if you haven't. How do you see corporate power at work in the fall of Assad? And what do you think the next move will be to reorganize power in the region to serve corporations? Well, there's no question that the Syrian rebel forces were trained, supported, and funded by the United States, Israel, and primarily Turkey. The next move, I suspect, will be the north and the east of Syria are controlled by the Kurds, U.S.-backed Kurds, Israeli-backed Kurds, but Turkey, and that's where the oil is, by the way, which of course is essentially cut or did cut the Assad regime and cuts the current regime off from its most important source of revenue. Um, but Turkey is determined to wipe out that Kurdish enclave. There are 50,000 ISIS jihadists in prisons. What happens if they're released? That's a good question. But Turkey is clear. Turkey has a long-standing animus towards Kurdish independence movements throughout the region. In particular, what's known as the PKK. This is the Turkish Kurdish movement. I spent a lot of time covering. I was actually with the PKK in northern Iraq, where they had bases, and the Turks see the Kurds as being allied with the PKK, and they want that enclave, quote unquote, cleansed. I think that's probably going to happen sooner rather than later. That it is immediately going to create tension between Turkey and Israel, and Turkey and the United States. But my read on it, I'm not there, so I'm always careful when I'm far away as a reporter. Sometimes when you're on the ground, your assumptions are shattered. But I suspect that Erdogan will soon be very aggressive. Um, so in terms of corporations, well, sure. I mean, it's like it's this creative destruction. You destroy, and then corporations go in and buy up utilities and everything else on the cheap, and then use them for profit. I don't know that we're there yet in Syria. Damascus only gets about an hour of electricity a day. Um, this government, which has a history of close links to jihadist groups like Al Qaeda, I suspect that, and here I think we look at the long term. I suspect that they will become increasingly more overt about their, Wahhabist or Salafist or whatever their orientation is as time moves on. I don't see how having a quote unquote Islamic State on the border with Israel is going to be good for Israel in the long run. But Israel is, of course, ecstatic because with the overthrow of the Assad regime, that corridor, that pipeline of arms and weapons from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon has been cut off. Um, all of this is not good for the region, and especially not good for the Palestinians. This is Joseph Woolslayer. Who will stop Israel? Who will end the Jewish supremacist occupation of the United States government that has empowered Israel? Exactly who? A state actor, a coalition of states, or the formation of a global mercenary army? Somehow the mass murders, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, the bloodshed will have to be ended. That, along with Israel's illegal expansionism, land and real estate theft. Yeah, I find so many echoes in the genocide in Gaza with the genocide of the Armenians by the Turks, because unlike the Holocaust, which the Nazis took great pains to hide, the Armenian genocide was well publicized. I mean, there were articles about it almost daily on the front page of the New York Times, and yet the world stood by and did nothing. I think 1.2, 1.5 million Armenians were killed in that genocide. This was around the time of World War I. And I used to when I worked in southeastern Turkey, I would come upon the ruins of these Armenian villages that didn't appear on a map, in the same way that I would run into tangled, overgrowth that had covered the remains of Palestinian villages that were no longer on a map, that no longer existed. So if history is any guide, the world will allow the genocide, unfortunately, to run its course. What will stop Israel? Well, the only way to stop Israel is to cut the arms shipments from the United States, because without those munitions Israel has used its stockpiles, the genocide in Gaza could not continue. That's certainly not going to happen. It wasn't going to happen under the Biden administration. It's not going to happen under the Trump administration. So that the funneling of weapons, I mean, Biden just, what was another $20 billion or so? I mean, it's a staggering sum of money that we have spent since October 7th in sustaining the genocide. And the only way to stop it is to pull the plug. I think Israel gets, even before these supplemental requests or arms shipments, Israel gets $3.8 billion a year in weapons and aid from the United States. But of course, things will change. The demographics among American Jews, especially younger Jews, show that there just isn't that loyalty to Israel. Anecdotally, when I was visiting Students for Justice in Palestine encampments, certainly a significant percentage of those students were Jewish. But we may be talking a generation to see that change. The only way that the change will occur is for Israel's sponsor and supporter to stop sponsoring and supporting Israel's occupation and military adventurism. This is Fernanda G. Is it possible for the international community to hold Israel accountable? The ICC and ICJ haven't done much. I'm wondering if the current actions warrants are just to make the war stop. I mean, the ICC and the ICJ clearly have, called for a ceasefire in essence, because they've called for these kinds of military activities to end. But the UN doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. It can't. Although Israel has no support other than the United States and a couple outlying island nations or something. There's no enforcement capability on the part of the United States. I mean, on the part of the United Nations. So I think most of the world is revolted at what Israel, and I mean, at this point, we're a full partner in the genocide, especially in the global South and in the Arab world, where I've spent a considerable amount of time since October 7th. The anger and even rage at the United States is just palpable, as it should be. But I don't. The only pressure point that I see is that will come from the United States and the political establishment, and in particular the Congress, has been bought up by the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby owns the Congress. I mean, you saw it when Netanyahu came to speak, and people, senators and Congress people were leaping to their feet as fast as they could to give him standing ovations. Bill Astor, why are so many experts, whether for Biden or Trump, spoiling for a war with Iran? Is it posturing? Will posturing turn into action, whether from calculation or miscalculation? Well, those who are spoiling for a war with Iran are the same people who brought us the debacles in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Ukraine. And they don't understand the Middle East. I mean, though Biden is not at this point driving probably any policy, certainly not Middle Eastern policy. But if you look at the people who are driving Middle East policy, Blinken, Amos, Hochstein, Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, they're either committed Zionists or they just are clueless. I mean, McGurk was a disaster in Iraq. They don't know what they're doing, and they don't understand what they're potentially igniting. they, I think, are kind of giddy over with the overthrow of Assad. They believe, as they did at the inception of the war in Iraq, that they are going to create a new Middle East through violence. It always, in the short term, appears that way because the use of massive industrial violence creates a kind of quiescence, as it did in Iraq for a while, as it does in Syria. But it isn't it doesn't work, and we have repeated examples of that, and it won't work in Iran. But these people are so myopic and so out of touch that they believe they can reshape the Middle East in their own vision through force, even though recent history is a vivid illustration that it doesn't work. Having used Sunni, this is Donald Smith, having used Sunni Muslims militants to oust Assad, will the U.S. and Israel now turn on them? Well, that's the history. So, I mean, remember that at a few years ago, there was, I think it was under the Obama administration, there was a plan to arm the Syrian jihadists. They were using the term "quote unquote" moderate rebels, which is ridiculous. And so they pumped $500 million worth of arms into Syria, and they realized that all these arms ended up in the hands of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and then they began bombing the very people they'd armed. They were kind of acted as a de facto air force for Assad. Um, so yeah, I mean, and the Kurds have just been betrayed. Betrayal is probably the hallmark of the West's relationship with the Kurds, going back decades. I mean, for instance, the Nixon administration armed the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north to put pressure on Saddam Hussein, and then in a deal between Iran and Iraq and the U.S., left them out to dry, and that's where you got what they call the Anfal, or this was this massive genocidal campaign in Iraq when we cut the Kurds off. So we have a bad habit of cutting the Kurds off, and I think the difference is that like Mosul, which is an oil rich, the areas that the Kurdish militia has is oil rich. And the question is, where's that oil going to end up? My guess is Turkey, but yeah, what is that Lord Salisbury quote? There are no permanent allies. There's only permanent power. And with the shifting sands of the Middle East, an ally one day becomes a perfidious enemy the next. I mean, remember when we were trying to overthrow the Islamic State? The Iranians sent significant numbers of quote unquote militia, but they were soldiers because they're Shia, to defend the Shia in Iraq. The Shiites comprise about 60% of Iraq, and you had a de facto alliance between U.S. forces on the ground and Iranian forces. They didn't fire on each other. I don't know how much they worked in tandem. I think they worked a bit in tandem. So that's a little kind of piece of recent Middle Eastern history that a lot of people didn't pay attention to. There was a moment on the ground in Iraq when we were working in concert with armed Iranian groups to wipe out the Sunni militants. So, I would not be at all surprised if, especially the Kurds, were sold out once again. Oh, okay. Chinchilla, how can we address the plight of Latvian whippet reindeer who are imprisoned and subjected to heavy petting against their will, all to drive obscene profits for their cartoonish owners? Well, we didn't get obscene profits. She's referring to the little Christmas video. We do one every year. Dwayne and I, and yeah, so you can watch it. It's up on the Substack. It's on YouTube though too, I think. So, this is from FRMware. Okay. Do you think the Gazans are now completely left adrift after the fall of Syria? Yeah, that's my fear. That is my fear. Israel has shifted a lot of its, especially its air power now, to southern Gaza. Nobody's looking, I think they feel, probably correctly. Um, I think this is really bad for the Palestinians, the kind of pressure that Hezbollah was able to put on Israel because of their alliance with Hamas and with the Palestinians in Gaza has been severely weakened, of course, because of the Israeli assaults on Hezbollah. I mean, it decapitated the leadership virtually, although Israel has had tremendous problems on the ground in southern Lebanon. The reports are that they've suffered, one figure is 4,000 casualties. A lot of these casualties are quite severe because the distances are very short. I mean, can drive from, I think, Beirut to Damascus in 2 hours or something, if you didn't have to go through all the checkpoints and everything else. So, um, uh, and Israel, when it takes heavy casualties, then resorts to heavy bombing, which of course they have obliterated whole sections of southern Lebanon. They've been bombing within Beirut. Um, so yeah, that's all really bad news for the Palestinians, unfortunately. This is Sparky. Shouldn't Erdogan take control of most of Syria right now? He has the only effective big ground force in NATO and might be Syria's only chance, albeit slim, to back away from being the next Libya. Well, Erdogan is the primary sponsor uh, Jolani and the current regime within. I think foolishly, I think Erdogan thinks he has a lot more influence and reach than he does. He does with some figures, but I don't. I don't think he controls the rebel movement or the new government in Syria as he thinks he does. Um, as I said earlier, I think Erdogan's primary focus now are the Kurds and the oil fields in the northeast, which are right on the border with Turkey. X speaks. Do you think the new Trump administration will respond to the needs and suffering of the working classes and the plight of rural Americans who voted in large numbers for him? No. I'm from rural America, where many are heavily armed and extremely angry. Do you think they will react if they feel they have been betrayed? And if so, what would reaction look like? Uh, well, the nature of uh, you know Trump and the Republican Party at this point is to demonize vulnerable groups within the society, especially immigrants, and blame them for the problems and essentially tacitly allow violence to be carried out against them. That will be the response. I don't expect the Trump administration to do anything for rural America, unfortunately. Of course, Biden didn't do anything for rural America. The Democrats sold out America, including rural America. I have significant parts of my family come from rural Maine on my mother's side of the family, and so I know what's happened in rural America, and I know the anger, legitimate anger, and I blame the Democrats, including for the current loss to Trump, that if they had embraced, as Bernie Sanders urged them to do, New Deal type reforms that actually ameliorated or addressed the suffering of the working class and rural Americans, I think they could have beat Trump in a landslide. But of course, they're corporate owned. So I don't think we're headed into a good place with Trump. The question goes on. Between our failing healthcare system, which the UN CEO killing brought to light, the economy, and the inflation, Trump's election and his administration's threat to the working class and the planet regarding climate change, I find that I, frankly speaking, care less and less about foreign policy for those of us who feel overwhelmed by the situation at home. Why is it important not to forget what is happening abroad? Well, because the military is hollowing the country out from the inside. Half of all discretionary spending goes to military adventurism, and it actually would be more officious to just take the money out, stacks of it, and burn it, because that military adventurism has boomerang, we call it blowback, within the Middle East, and Ukraine and everywhere else to our detriment. Well, the Arnold Toynbee, when he writes about the collapse of civilizations, always cites the um, the unregulated, uncontrolled military as being uh, probably the most important marker to the death knell of a civilization. That's why we should care about what's happening abroad, because as all of this money goes into these military fiascos, going all the way back to Vietnam, our country is collapsing, literally. I mean, our tribe, I have to take the trains into New York. Half the time they don't show up, they show up late, they break down. The roads are falling apart. We have the most expensive healthcare. You mentioned it. Healthcare in I think the average family pays something like 23,000 or 25,000 a year, and then they get all they don't even get coverage. I mean, they have to spend another 5,000 before even the uh, insurance company will kick in any pay. I mean, and then you get dropped, especially if you get grievously ill and you can't work and you can't pay, and then you go into bankruptcy. I mean, it's just completely mercenary and collapsing. I mean, where the military is hollowing the country out from the inside, which is why we should care about the foreign policy establishment and the military establishment. Um, so someone asked about the fate of the Kurds. I addressed that. Do you know the current status of Öcalan? I think Öcalan's still in prison, in a Turkish prison, but I haven't checked. Um, so Robert, do you think Biden will do something to obstruct the possibility of Trump making a deal to stop the war in Ukraine, like attacking Iran? Well, Biden, they just gave Ukraine a lot of money. I think at this point, everybody knows the war in Ukraine is not sustainable. Even Zelensky knows it. They will do what they should have done before the war began, which was negotiate a land for peace deal. The ethnic Russians will essentially have some kind of link to Russia. That was all possible before the war, but we have to remember that this war was never about defending Ukraine. It was a proxy war, and the goals of those carrying out the proxy war were twofold. One, they wanted to degrade the Russian military at the expense of Ukraine, including, of course, Ukrainian men and women. And the second was isolate Putin from Europe. They succeeded. Those were their goals. The idea that in a war of attrition, the Ukrainians had any hope of success was something that, I think most hard-headed military strategists understood was an impossibility. Um, what's happening now is that essentially they will try and uh, negotiate a ceasefire that will allow NATO to rearm and rebuild whatever rump Ukraine is in, and that's something Putin is determined to prevent. But that's where we are. The war in Ukraine is over, and that's the tragedy. It should have never been fought. I mean, we baited. I'm not defending what Russia did, but we baited them into the war. We broke our promise of not extending NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. I was in Germany at the time. I heard Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker and everyone else make those promises to Gorbachev. And because of hubris, because we believed it was now a unipolar world and the United States would rule forever, coupled with the billions of dollars that arms manufacturers could make by reconfiguring military establishments in Eastern and Central Europe to be NATO compatible, we push NATO right up to the gates of Russia, and it was never a secret. Everyone knew. There's even a cable written by William Burns, now head of the CIA, who was the ambassador to Russia, who said that it doesn't matter what the political position is in Russia, everybody sees Ukraine as a red line. But we did it anyway, and that's where we are with Ukraine. Michael Wagner, has World War III started already? And if not, is it just a matter of when? It could. I mean, once you begin playing with these kinds of forces, especially if it happens that we go to war with Iran, these things can always spiral out of control. Barbara Tuchman in The Guns of August does a beautiful job of explaining how most of the monarchies in Europe didn't particularly, except for maybe the Kaiser, did not want a war, but through miscalculation and ignorance and foolishness plunged Europe into the suicidal folly of World War One. Yes, it can. And they're, giving anti-ballistic missiles so that uh, Ukraine can strike targets in Russia. This is just nuts. It's just utter insanity. All of these provocations can and once the provocations begin, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, if we get a massive Iranian attack, a serious Iranian attack on Israel, and up until now, these Iranian attacks have been very restrained. But if there's a significant, I mean, for instance, if a few hundred people are killed in Tel Aviv or something, yeah, I mean, then we've lost control, and that's why it's always dangerous once you start flirting with these kinds of tit for tat military exchanges. They can spiral out of control, and it doesn't matter what the intent of the people carrying out those military exchanges are. R. Dougherty, will Trump give Israel the non-nuclear GBU-43 massive ordnance airbust bomb known as Moab? I don't know that they need it because they have these bombs that already can obliterate tunnels. I mean, Moab, that's what they used to, I think, drop on the caves where Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. I mean, these are I mean, that would be used against very deep underground fortification. I'm not an expert on Moab, but I don't think Israel. I think Israel has more than enough ordnance and heavy ordnance to obliterate what's left of Gaza. Gray Dovey, do you think a reason for the sabotage of the Arab Spring was that Israel couldn't allow a stable or democratic Middle East for its legitimacy? The sabotage of the Arab Spring, uh, I mean, it was different in every country. So, for instance, in Egypt, it brought to power the Muslim Brotherhood and the army, backed by the Israeli Mossad and the CIA, did not want Islamic government in Egypt and overthrew the regime and put in Sisi, who's a pretty vicious dictator, in Tunisia. You saw a kind of opening and then a closure. In Syria, Assad reacted with violence against the Arab Spring, which gave birth to the jihadists. So, um, uh, I mean, Israel is not interested in independent Arab government. So when I was in Egypt a few months ago, I had dinner with the former Minister of Information for Gamal Abdel Nasser, who Sadat had threw into prison for a decade. And he said, Israel is able to do what it does in Gaza and the West Bank, not because it's strong, but because the Arab governments are weak. And I thought that was a pretty brilliant assessment, in that the Arab regimes are so corrupt, so dependent. When I was in Jordan this summer, there were weekly demonstrations on behalf of the Palestinians. A huge segment of the Jordanian population is of Palestinian descent, and they were chanting against King Abdullah, and chanting, "We are all Hamas." So the longer these conflicts go on, the more these the weaker these regional allies become. I mean, Sisi's very worried. The Jordanian monarchy, I mean, they call themselves monarchs, dictators, are very worried, because they are very fragile. I think even in Saudi Arabia, these are very fragile, hated governments, and they can't take a lot of stress. Um, This is Mehdi Ahmadi. What's the end game for the Saudis and the Chosen? What's the end game for the Saudis? I mean, the Saudis, they pay lip service, of course, to Palestinian rights, but they consider the Palestinians to be a headache. The end game for the Saudis is to make sure that they have substantial military contracts with the United States. It's interesting. We've seen a kind of rapprochement recently between the Saudis and the Iranians. I'm not sure how far that will go. Um, uh, so there's already a kind of tacit alliance between countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and but the problem was, as I said, within the Saudi population, like the rest of the Middle East, um, there is a great deal of anger over what's happened to the Palestinians. So these regimes have to walk very carefully, which is why Saudi Arabia is not able to, after October 7th, continue down that road of building diplomatic relations with Israel. This is Susan Spicer. Why are we seeing so many populist governments rise in the world? Is it a moral or spiritual crisis? I think you're talking about right-wing populist governments. Yeah, it's neoliberalism. It's the rise of neoliberal global forces that have essentially seized control. I mean, you saw it when Syriza took power in Greece. What it illustrated is that the Greeks don't control their own economy. They don't even control their own central bank. So and these kinds of forces have deformed countries around the world, and you have vomited up figures like Trump or Orban or Marie Le Pen or Modi in India or others, and they're a result of these economic distortions, which is why they mirror each other. This is Rafi Simonton. Is the reaction to the United Healthcare assassination loud enough for the Democrats to hear the rage of 80% class majority? Will their arrogance certainly yet again prevent them from understanding why a Democratic Party representing only professionals and bureaucrats loses? Yeah, what has been the response? The response has been all these CEOs to hire private security. They have no intention of changing the system because they are the system, and most of the Democratic political leadership, Pelosi, everyone else, without corporate backing, they wouldn't hold power, and they would rather have the whole ship go down and they stay in their first-class cabins than reform. So, no, I don't expect any change at all, and to what extent they understand, I don't know. I mean, the postmortems they've done on the Harris campaign are kind of frightening. It just every postmortem I read just shows how utterly clueless they are. Edgar Rincon, what are your thoughts on what Trump's foreign policy could look like in the Middle East? Well, it'll look exactly like Biden with this difference. So if, for instance, Israel tomorrow announces that they're annexing the West Bank, the Biden administration and the State Department will say that they have grave concerns and that, this is contravening international law and do nothing. Whereas if Trump, if it was in power, he would embrace it. But for the Palestinians on the ground, it has zero difference. Gray Dovey, how should Arabs see the legacy of the Arab Spring? Well, they need to understand why it failed. And part of it was class consciousness. Part of it was a failure. Like, let's take the case of Egypt. So when they overthrew Mubarak, very foolishly, the leaders of the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square looked at the military as an ally. The military was never an ally. The military was determined to essentially shut down Egypt again, which they've done through Sisi. I think also in terms of organizing, flash mobs are very effective at creating a crowd, but they're not particularly effective at overthrowing a power structure. Um, what you need essentially is an alliance with labor and the ability to strike. Um, so, but that was, there were series of uprisings around the globe, not just in the Arab world, and all of them sputtered kind of, to an end, and for many of the same reasons. Mark Colson, in your last Q&A, you made it sound as if there was some difference between Christian and secular morality, in particular on sympathy for the oppressed. I find this bizarre given sociologists like Phil Zuckerman, who, using common measures of social welfare, have convincingly shown that secular societies are more moral than Christian societies like our own. Even more bizarre is that as someone devoted to the pursuit of truth, why, in the face of evidence from scientific cosmology and evolutionary biology, would you take Christianity or any other form of monotheism seriously? The overwhelming majority of scientists in our National Academy are non-believers for good reason. Well, I don't think that there's a difference between Christian and secular morality. I'm a great admirer of Camus, who was certainly an atheist. H. Richard Niebuhr once said, religion is a good thing for good people and a bad thing for bad people. Religious institutions have certainly carried out more carnage and damage and throughout history than perhaps any other. And every war that I covered, like the war in Bosnia, the Catholic hierarchy in Croatia embraced the genocidal campaign of the Croats against the Serbs. The Serbian Orthodox Church embraced the genocidal campaign in Bosnia against the Muslims and the Croats. I mean, the institutions were always awful. And I don't think that secular societies are more moral than Christian societies. They're probably, I would say, they're probably just as immoral as Christian societies. I don't like institutional religion. And I think the great religious thinkers, Buddha, the prophet, they were all, Steiner writes about this. They were all grappling with, fundamental moral issues, but then you built up institutions around them that essentially perpetuated themselves and sacralized. I mean, look at the Inquisition or anything else, sacralized savage repression. I mean, even campaigns of evil. So it's the religious impulse that I admire, but not the religious institutions. I don't think any religious society is not just Christian. I mean, Modi's, fundamentalist Hinduism, it all scares me because it essentially uses religion as a way to otherize those people who are outside of that religious group and dehumanize them and carry out campaigns against them, which is exactly, of course, what Israel is doing with the Palestinians. Although, of course, within the Palestinian community, there are uh, Christians as well as Muslims. So, yeah, I think, I don't actually disagree with you. I am no friend of any institution. All institutions, as I've said this many times, the theologian Paul Tillich wrote, are inherently demonic, including the church. Institutions care about their own survival and their own perpetuation. It's only individuals who can act morally, and those people don't need to come out of a religious tradition. I saw it. Some of them do, some of them, and some of the worst perpetrators of bigotry and repression and are, wear that cloak of religion. But I don't, that kind of religiosity or that kind of fundamentalism is something that I have attacked, especially in my book, American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War in America, who I didn't use the word fascist lightly. Bill Apgood, is there any evidence that you can see of a growing awareness in the Israeli population of the Ponzi scheme nature of the militaristic course for the Netanyahu government, and any sense of growing tensions between the different social and political divisions within Israel as a result of the toll in the society and as a result of the war? No, I don't think the Israelis see. You obviously watched that interview I did with Alistair Crook, which is kind of a brilliant analysis of Israeli society and where we're going in the Middle East. He talks about it as a Ponzi scheme. I think it's right. Israel tends to go giddy over, when they killed Sinwar or when they, attack Lebanon. I mean, this is just deeply embedded within Israeli society, and then things invariably go very, very wrong. And then they try and pretend it's not happening, like Gaza. I mean, Gaza is just it's horrible for the Palestinians, but it's also kind of fiasco for Israel. I mean, where does it end? When does it end? Hamas is still killing Israeli soldiers. Um, so uh, Somebody asked about, is Turkey likely to invade the oil rich? Yes, I think so. That was Sam K. Um, Tommy Boyle, with your knowledge and wisdom and experience, would you ever consider an advisory role in the Trump team, perhaps as a conflict de-escalation manager? No, because the Trump team is a non-reality based. I mean, so is Biden's team, but they're not grounded in a reality, nor they understand the um, the darkness. I mean, the savagery of the American empire. They glorify both America and the empire without understanding it. So they would never ask me anyway. Um, we're going to do one more. Um, okay, this is Mehdi Ahmadi. To what extent will the U.S. continue its foreign policy in the Middle East at its own detriment and long-term loss? Where's the breaking point? That's a good question, because the fact is none of the people who have orchestrated these fiascos in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Ukraine are held accountable. And that just goes back decades. Then and because we don't hold our political or military class unaccountable, in fact, we promote them. You still have people like Petraeus and Clapper and others who are they're amplified on media, usually as uh, experts being interviewed, and because we don't hold them accountable, we leap from fiasco to fiasco to fiasco, and this is a characteristic of all late empires. The start of any empire, they tend to use military force very judiciously, but as empire declines and decays, it tends to strike out in an incoherent or irrational way in order to regain a lost hegemony, which is what we're doing. It never works. It only accelerates the death spiral. And there's all sorts of tainter of the collapse of complex civilizations. Arnold Toynbee, as I mentioned before. I mean, there's all sorts of writers who have studied the decline of empires and the characteristics of empires in decline, and that's always key. And that's precisely what we're replicating. So it's a really good point that these people carry out policies that are in essence suicidal, because they're not held accountable, and because in their desperation they can believe that they can use military force or violence to regain what they've lost, and of course they can't. And that is where we are, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House. That's where we're headed, and we didn't talk about it, but of course, being aggressive, the aggressive military posture against China is part of that desperate bid to regain a lost hegemony with China's rise. But that itself, of course, is exceedingly, exceedingly dangerous. Great. Well, thanks for watching. You can watch our Christmas video Dwayne and I did, and uh, filmed by Thomas and with Sophia. And let's hope we don't attack Iran.